Dr. Freckleton, I'm still concerned about the AR-15.
Yes. Well, with respect, with reason, Your Honour.
So it wasn't identified apparently by any of the police on the evening that it was not appropriate to be carried.
That's right.
And then of course we know that it or something like it was out again in the community the following morning.
Yes. Well, I'm going to cover that with the Deputy Commissioner, but yes.
All right.
Well, there were several people, just to put you in context, there were several people who guarded the crime scene, and it seems to have just been one group of three who carried those, Your Honour. But you'll hear...
and they didn't know that it wasn't appropriate?
It appears not. But
so
it wasn't appropriate.
How could anyone be confident that the police are making appropriate decisions in communities about those kinds of firearms? How could the community be confident when there were so many people who were aware that these firearms were being carried in the community and yet no one identified that it was inappropriate or did anything about it?
I'm not wanting to minimise Your Honour's observation, but the evidence establishes that there are the 4 IRT members. I don't think one can include the man with the dog. And there are the 3 members who were at the crime scene the next day. And it is relevant, but there's no suggestion that those who guarded the crime scene before or after did the same thing. So what one has is 7 junior members, and they are all quite junior, who made a bad decision.
in charge of this IRT group, wasn't he?
I'm not
That's
sure.
an issue, isn't it?
It is an issue. There should have been a clearly designated member. He was the most senior by his time in the IRT from memory, and marginally by rank. None of them were senior in any way.
And the IRT are the ones that are supposed to be trained and have knowledge around the use and deployment
Yes.
of these weapons.
Yes, that's right. And one of the things that should have taken place, if I can answer Your Honour, is that at that 5 o'clock meeting, there should have been clarity about what was being taken, as well as who was going to be where, and how the apprehension was going to be attempted. All of that clarity should have been there.
But who do you think would have been leading this 5 a.m. meeting who would have had the clarity and leadership to do that?
If Sergeant Frost was there, it should have been she. If she was not there, this was a specialist unit that apprehended people all the time. That was one of their reasons for existence. So there should have been a discussion which incorporated the input of the one man there who knew Kumanjayi, Alafaya, and between them they should have come to a clear consensus.
Well, it seems pretty clear that the IRT consensus would have been that they would carry a weapon, seeing as they went out to carry it when they weren't doing much the night before.
Well, if it shouldn't have been, Your Honour, and if that was their consensus, it would have been the wrong consensus.
Well, I'm just concerned that there's clarity and a plan moving forward to prevent the same
Yes.
issues arising.
Yes.
At the moment, I'm not.
Your Honour
100% sure
might
what
be
that
thinking.
plan is, but
Your
I know
Honour,
the IRT's disbanded at
well,
the
it
moment.
is. But nonetheless, General Duties members have these tasks, and sometimes the TRG has this kind of a task. And if Your Honour were contemplating a recommendation that there be clarity every time as to whether a long arm be carried in community, you won't find any opposition from the Northern Territory Police Force.
Yes, sorry, go on.
No, but thank you, Your Honour, it's helpful, thank you. Is there anything further that you would like to say about that issue, Deputy Commissioner?
Just as a general principle, Your Honour, the carrying of long arms in communities is not routine practice, and I'm not aware, in my experience, of anywhere else we've done it. From time to time, there is a need for the police, obviously, to carry high-powered weapons, destruction of animals, and other tasks that have occurred since that I'm aware of. But again, I would like to point out, Your Honour, it is a very rare event.
If somebody, for instance, was known himself or herself to be carrying a weapon, would that potentially be a scenario in which a long arm ought to be carried?
Well, it's totally appropriate, in which case I would support that activity based upon the risk to the community and to the police, yes.
I'd just like to raise one last issue about the planning, and that is the role of a local person who had previously taken Kumanjayi into custody, whether that be an Alafeo or a Williams. Can you say a little bit more to Her Honour about the advantages in terms of a negotiated resolution of having someone involved who knew and had prior experience interacting with Kumanjayi?
Just, Your Honour, the evidence we've already heard provides some clarity that the best peaceful resolution at any time is to have strong communication with the community and to allow the community to assist us in the apprehension. And if that can occur, I think we get far better outcomes from every angle.
Well, let's descend to specifics rather than the community more generally. Kumanjayi knew certain police at the station by reason of prior interactions, most of which were non-violent and pretty cooperative. And Derek Williams, for instance, has told Her Honour about how he'd spent time talking to Kumanjayi and had effectively been able to talk things through with him. It took a while, but then got him into custody without any kind of an issue. So, how integral to a mitigating risk was having someone like that integrally involved?
Well, Your Honour, it'd be helpful, but again, conversely, for police officers right across the territory, you don't always have access to people who can facilitate that at short notice, and the eternal dilemma between discretion and the execution of a lawful process, and having cultural sensitivities is complex.
But
it's
here
difficult.
You've got Alafeo available on Sunday, and I think Williams on Monday.
Yes.
So, how should they have been incorporated into an apprehension?
Well, I think the plan clearly identifies Alafeo as being one of the key players for his local knowledge, local intelligence and identification purposes, as we've discussed. That's what should have happened. That was the plan.
So a cordon and contain exercise, and so what would Alafeo have been doing if the four members had been cordoning and containing, and Donaldson had been outside just in case Kumanjayi made a run for it?
Well, again, Your Honour, I'm speculating, but I imagine if it was, he would be the one who'd be knocking on the door asking, is Kumanjayi here, and negotiating with the family and him if he was there to surrender.
Thank you. I'm going to pass over the final tragic events and move to matters after the shooting. An issue of significant sensitivity for members of Kumanjayi's family was that Kumanjayi was dragged to get him into the police car to go back to the station and attend to his condition. What do you say about that?
Again, Your Honour, I've extended an apology on behalf of the Northern Territory Police Force. It doesn't comply with our general order, and I wish it had not occurred.
You make reference in paragraph 233 to the requirements of that's of your first affidavit, to the requirements of the police force. The fact that dragging of prisoners was the subject of an instruction in 2013, but then there was an updated instruction in 2018, which was unequivocal. There are no circumstances in which dragging should occur. Is that right?
Correct.
Right. You qualify the situation a little bit by saying that while what was done was disrespectful and it has caused distress, the situation was, as you put it, dire. What did you mean by that?
That the actions taken by the attending members was urgent, and they needed to remove, in their mind, and I support that decision, from that location to another.
Now, why? Why not try to take health measures with him where he was at that point?
I just think there was probably better opportunity, and it's been covered on the evidence I heard, Your Honour, that the police station provided a better facility for enabling them to do that in a safe and operating environment they're familiar with, access to communications, access to what limited serious first aid equipment they had. I think there was an ambulance there. There are a number of factors that I think, in my mind, I would have done the same thing.
I'd like to cover off the issue of care given to Kumanjayi. I think you've seen video footage of what took place at the station.
I have.
And each one of those members, Donaldson, Ebel, Hawkins, and particularly Kirstenfeld and Rolfe, provided care and talked to Kumanjayi while he was there, calling him brother and similar, and tried to provide him with reassurance, and then endeavoured to maintain his life with the equipment that was there. What do you say about that?
I say it was appropriate, Your Honour, and done professionally. I think they did all in their powers to preserve the life of Kumanjayi Walker.
Sergeant Frost delegated that role to the members, some of whom had particular training and experience by reason of their having been in the army. What do you say about her having delegated that rather than getting involved herself?
I think, Your Honour, as that role as the senior member present at the time, I think it was appropriate. I think there was lots of other factors that would have been forefront in the mind when we've got appropriate people doing a good job as best they can. I don't think she'd added to that at all, and there was clearly other things that needed to be resolved from an administrative and logistical point of view for police.
Now, I want to raise 3 sensitive matters with you in logical sequence. The first is the failure to invite in any members of Kumanjayi's family when he was clearly in a bad way, and then when he was dying. Then I'm going to raise with you the issue of the evacuation, which was contemplated for a time. Then I'm going to raise with you the use of the ambulance when the additional members were brought from the airport. So let's go to the first one. Entirely understandably, members of Kumanjayi's family are distressed at the fact that they were not able to be with and provide reassurance to Kumanjayi when he was in distress and then when he was passing away. This is a very upsetting and confronting issue. What do you say about the decision that was made in that regard?
Your Honour, having viewed the body-worn video, it was highly graphic, highly distressing for everybody present. My extensive experience, Your Honour, wherever appropriate, police would take steps to preserve the dignity of a dead or dying person. I've seen it countless times in public places and even hospitals and elsewhere, and steps would be made to ensure that we didn't further distress people watching it, viewing it. We would take steps to, if it was in a public place, you'd put a blanket around to make sure you provide some dignity. I don't think it was inappropriate of the police to try and prevent that exposure to the family for what was clearly a very graphic event.
I want to do this with a bit of sensitivity, Deputy Commissioner, but there seemed to me, from having viewed the video, to be 2 phases. One was where they were trying to work through where he had been injured, shot, and staunch the flow of blood, and then there was and comfort him, and then there was the period when they were trying to keep his heart going. Use of, defibrillator. Going to that first one, you viewed the video.
Yes.
There is quite a significant loss of blood, and he was at times distressed. Would it have been appropriate, in your view, during that phase for family members to have been present?
No.
Again, just enlarge on your one word.
Again, I found it highly graphic. I found it very confronting. I think the police officers were acting with appropriate response and dignity to a severely injured person, and the potential, just of having other people present. As I said, it wouldn't be allowed in the hospital. It wouldn't, there's some efforts to preserve the dignity of a dying person. I think it was a priority. I don't think we should have had people there. There's additional factors around family members. I mean, if it was normal practice, hospitals would allow it openly, and they don't. I mean, I've been to many localities where people, unfortunately, are in that last stage of life, and generically speaking, I think we should take every step to preserve the dignity of a dying person. I don't know necessarily that it sounds that a loved one would want to be there, but I don't know that it's always appropriate, Your Honour. That's my view.
Well, that attends to both phases, I think, so I won't ask you more about that unless there's anything else that Your Honour would like to canvass in that regard.
So you think that's the reason why family were not permitted in, to preserve the dignity?
That's my belief, Your Honour. I think had they contemplated, and clearly they were focusing very heavily on preserving his life, that was a logical view that a police officer would hold. I don't think it's designed to provoke a family member.
Now, I'd like to canvass the separate issue that arises after Kumanjayi passes and take you to paragraphs 362 and following of your third affidavit, please. It is apparent from the evidence, and you identify this in your own affidavit, that there was a high level of concern on the part of at least Sergeant Frost, and then afterwards Superintendent Knowles, who was in close communication with her about safety once Kumanjayi had passed. And an initial decision was made to evacuate the community, and that was overturned by Assistant Commissioner Worst.
Yes.
Could you provide your assessment of concerns on the part of Sergeant Frost and Superintendent Knobs, and then the decision making by the Assistant Commissioner of the day?
Your Honour, having heard the evidence in this inquest, I understand the apprehension that was raised by Sergeant Frost and relayed to Superintendent Knobs. However, I do support the decision of Assistant Commissioner Worst. I don't think the evacuation of the Yunamu Police Station was necessary and the right decision was reached. And, any instance of a police leaving a police facility would be viewed very closely. It's not something we would normally, unless it was really extraordinary circumstances, contemplate.
You make reference in your paragraph 363 not to payback, because that's not the right term, is it?
That's correct.
But you make reference to a concern about retribution or hostility or distress when the community might learn that Kumanjayi had passed before members had come in from Alice Springs and before the TRG had arrived.
Correct.
What do you say from what you can tell of what Sergeant Frost has recited to Her Honour and described in the statements, and the evaluation of Mr. Knobs of scenarios in which he's been involved, of their state of mind about what might occur?
Your Honour, having heard their evidence in this court, their apprehension was real in my mind. They spoke passionately and honestly, I think, about their deep-seated fear of what could occur. from the evidence that's been led and from my knowledge of those individuals in my career, I suspect some of their fears may have been well founded. I don't support the leaving of the police station, and that decision by Assistant Commissioner Worst was the right decision to make.
You make reference to some considerations in your paragraph 364, both in terms of what happened that night and what happened immediately afterwards.
Yes.
A situation, it might be thought, could be somewhat volatile when a police officer has come in from outside with colleagues, and regardless of the rights or wrongs of what has happened, it's resulted in the death by shooting with a long arm of a member of the community.
Pistol.
Sorry? No, I beg your pardon, I didn't shoot him with a long arm, but they came in with the
correct,
long arm that
yes.
Mr Hawkins was carrying. I beg your pardon, I've got it badly. But a member of the community has been shot. Now, the community, from what we've seen from Samara Fernandez-Brown, assembled, at least a significant number of them, it's hard to say how many, outside the police station. They talked, they expressed concern, sometimes there was some noise. But from what we've seen of the video footage, the behaviour was very restrained, was it not?
Yes.
Now, how does that restrained behaviour that we can see in the cold light of the courtroom 3 years later link in with the concerns which Sergeant Frost seems to have been experiencing?
I think, Your Honour, and again, looking back on the evidence that I've heard and what I've seen in my experience, I think the fear or the apprehension of what could occur was well founded. There was a noise, there was disturbance out the front, there was raised voices, there was obviously concern by the attending members, as we've discussed. A member of the community has been shot, subsequently dies. I think it would have been a very, very difficult and confronting circumstance for any person. And I really struggled to see how we could have and what we could have done differently, and I like to reflect upon that in every possible context. But the police formed a view that they were in fear of their safety.
There was a report of a fire having been lit in the grass somewhere near the health centre as well. How does that factor in?
Well, I think they all contribute to their sense of apprehension, Your Honour.
Nonetheless, the experienced and more senior head of Assistant Commissioner Worst was applied, and you say in your paragraph 365 he was right to overturn the decision and to order the members to stay there. And then you reflect on the circumstances in which it is appropriate for police to withdraw entirely from a community for a time, whether you term that a tactical withdrawal or anything else. Can you say a little bit more to Her Honour about that kind of a scenario?
Well, just in generic sense, Your Honour, the police are there to provide community safety for everybody. It'd be something that we would take extremely gravely that we'd actually leave, because then there were potential community members who may require police response that were unavailable to attend. So it would be a very, very rare event where we would tactically withdraw or leave a police station through violence, but it's not uncommon that the police would retreat to the police station when we're confronted with wide-scale community violence. So rather than provoke, attempt arrests, take overt action at that moment in time, it's not uncommon that police would revert to the police station and await for either sufficient numbers or resources to become available to provide deployment options. But, Your Honour, it's not... In fact, I'm not aware of any other instance where we've left a police station through violence in the community.
One of the contexts for all of this was, of course, that the health personnel had left late on the Saturday morning or early in the afternoon after they'd been the victim of a variety of break-ins to their houses and to their cars and similar But the bottom line was that they'd left for Ullamoo and were not present anymore in Uindamu. Now, was that a relevant factor for the plan that was ultimately deployed in respect of the apprehension of Kumanjayi Walker? There weren't health personnel there.
I don't think it was well considered as part of that operational plan. The police were aware there was no one present. But again, I think, fortunately, Your Honour, police officers discharging firearms in communities is a very, very rare event.
So it's a factor that ought to have been incorporated in risk assessment before the apprehension of Kumanjayi was undertaken.
It may have assisted in their decision making, yes.
All right. Let's go to another factor. There was a man there with a dog.
Yes.
And dogs are utilised by the police force. Do you say it was appropriate or otherwise for a man with a dog to be taken as part of the plan to take Kumanjayi into custody?
Yeah, I think it was appropriate.
Let's then talk a little bit more about the use of dogs. At paragraphs 151 and following, you provide some information about the use of dogs, and Her Honour's received some evidence about that already from Sergeant Donaldson. You have assembled some statistical material in relation to the use of dogs, but before we get there, you describe at 154 the use of a dog as a tactical use of force option available to police members. Is that right?
Yes.
And, but the use of a dog has to comply with, amongst other things, the 10 operational safety principles.
Yes.
And one of the reasons for that, I suppose, is that the dog can cause injury to the person who's being apprehended.
Correct.
In 155, you identify a selection of tactical options, numbered amongst which is the use of a dog. Can you say some more about what you mean in paragraph 155 to Her Honour, please?
Again, the principles around deployment of any use of force is to use the least amount of force available. That's an underlying principle. I think the deployment of a dog, for example, along with any other options that you've got for deployment for apprehension or community arrest phase, is really, really quite a powerful tool for police. The data that's contained within my affidavit has provided to me clearly indicates, Your Honour, that on most occasions they're really just there for presence. Their actual physical deployment on the ground to apprehend people is minimal. But again, in my experience, when confronted with people with weapons and other things, they provide a real viable safety option for not only the police but for the person they're about to apprehend, as compared to a more lethal force of option.
Let's go to those figures then. You describe in paragraph 157 the numbers of times over a period of approximately, well, it's 3 years, 2019, 2020 and 2021, that the dog operations unit was deployed and the outcomes. And you explained that use of force forms were submitted in respect of the overwhelming majority of those deployments. What's the obligation in terms of the use of force form to be generated when a dog is involved in an apprehension?
It allows certainly us as the agency, as the Northern Territory Police Force, to monitor and track deployment and where we have use of force, if there's any specific issues that follow from it. A use of force report does not necessarily indicate that there's been actual use of force. It just means the dog or whatever was present and applied. It doesn't mean that because the use of force report's been submitted that the dog bit or did anything.
Most of the time, in fact, it's simply still in the car or standing there.
On most occasions, yes.
All right. Now, you describe over 5,000 use of force forms, and you say that there was only active involvement on 45 occasions. And of those, there were 18 instances of injuries being inflicted over that 3-year period.
That's correct.
And of those 18, all of them were in a metropolitan environment.
Correct.
And the overwhelming majority were with adults. And most of the injuries, you say in paragraph 161, were minor lacerations, grazes and abrasions. Only 4 of them in that full 3-year period involved puncture wounds.
Correct.
Now, pulling all of that together, what do you say about the appropriateness of having the dog as a backup in the background for the apprehension of Kumanjayi if it had been done properly?
I think it was appropriate and logical thinking by planning.
Now I've taken you on that distraction, and I'm sorry about that, to health personnel and dogs. But we've just attended to the issue of evacuation. Let's go now to the fact that the family was not told that Kumanjayi had passed. He passed at, I think it's 8:36 on the Saturday evening, and it's well into the next morning. We'll come to that in due course, that they are informed of that. The decision is made by Assistant Commissioner Worst that they are to stay there. But there are the members of the IRT and that small number of members of the UN demonstration who were there. And there are 2 plans quickly made to bring in more resources from Alice Springs by air flight, and then to bring in TRG members lest they be required to keep the peace. Correct?
Correct.
What do you say about bringing in those extra personnel for a start, first from Alice Springs and then the TRG?
I think that's entirely appropriate and well-founded.
And when you say that, do you mean any criticism of the community?
No. I think the apprehension by the police at the time and the decision-making around having sufficient resources in the event something untoward did happen, because it's all pre-planning for what may happen, that it was appropriate, both for the members present and for the safety of the community. Infrastructure on the ground.
To look at contingencies in making plans of that kind?
So, sorry.
Is it appropriate for those making decisions about, for instance, when to tell the community and thinking about what might ensue after the tragic news is conveyed, to think about what might be the contingencies? What
Absolutely, and incumbent upon them to do so, absolutely.
Right. Now, it's clear that a decision is made not to tell members of his family for some time, and we know that, and we'll come to the circumstances of this soon, the members from Alice Springs are retrieved a bit after midnight, I think, and then the members of the TRG are retrieved from the airport, I think somewhere around 1:30. Julie's nodding, so that's about right. Now, what do you say about the correctness or otherwise of not telling members of the family about the death before the TRG arrives? Because there is an obligation to communicate in general terms the passing of someone as soon as it is reasonably practicable, is there not?
Correct.
All right, so let's deal with this failure to communicate this passing before the arrival of the TRG members.
In my view, Your Honour, I think it was sound thinking and appropriate for the members on the ground to await for sufficient other police resources that become on the ground before they made that notification in the event that it did lead to further community unrest.
Do you recognise that that is a source of distress and aggrievement now for the family members who feel that they should have been told straight away or close to it?
I do, Your Honour, and again, we've extended an apology on behalf of the Northern Territory Police Force, and I have heard heartfelt apologies from both Sergeant Frost and Superintendent Nobbs about actions and decisions they made on the night.
Now, I've asked you about this period between the 8:36 passing and the arrival of the TRG.
Yes.
We'll go into the detail of this in a minute, but there is a passage of some hours after the arrival of the TRG before the sergeant or sergeants go and speak to members of the family. What do you say about that?
Again, Your Honour, I can understand the distress it's caused. From the evidence that I've heard, it's clear that Sergeant Zhang, Senior Sergeant Zhang, as the new police forward commander, was clearly overwhelmed with a whole raft of activity that he was planning and proposing to do, and he probably didn't put it at the forefront of his mind.
All right, let's be absolutely straightforward with Her Honour about it. Should the family have been told promptly after the arrival of the TRG in a suitable way that Kumanjayi had passed
Well, once
away?
we had sufficient resource on the ground, yes, I think we should have provided that as soon as practicable.
Now, the decision had been made during this early phase, prior to, for now, the arrival of the additional members from Alice Springs, not to tell the family members for the reasons that you've described. An ambulance was taken to the airfield and Mr. Rolfe was dispatched elsewhere, and the new members who had arrived were brought back to the police station. Should that ambulance have been used in that process?
No.
Why not?
Again, it further led to community distrust and deception by the police that created a belief in their mind that Kumanjayi Walker was being flown from the community when that wasn't the fact. And again, I've heard the heartfelt apologies from the decision makers on the night who agonised over that decision, and again, we shouldn't have done it.
And not only that, but a health department person was requested to drive the ambulance and was injured in rocks that were sent at the ambulance that night. Was it appropriate to use a health department person for that purpose?
No, Your Honour. And again, we apologise to Nurse Walcott for that decision and the fact that she was injured.
TRG members arrived at a little bit after 1:30 in the morning, 1:17 I'm told. They were brought from the airport to the station, and Senior Sergeant Zhang met them there, and they settled in to make sure that the premises were secured. Yes?
Yes.
All right. Again, appropriate that the TRG was there, and appropriate that they keep a low profile and respond if it became necessary for them to do so.
Yes.
Now, I want to ask you some more questions about the response then during this period. There was a need to keep the 5 men who had been involved in the attempted arrest of Kumanjayi apart so far as that was possible, was it not? Was it not?
Yes.
Now, Her Honour has heard that Sergeant Zhang said that shortly after he arrived, he had a briefing with members present, and he asked members not to discuss the incident. What do you say about the appropriateness or otherwise of that?
I think his actions were clearly appropriate and in line with the general order that covers deaths in custody and provided clarity.
Now, Her Honour has heard that Phillips, who became the initial investigator, communicated with Mr. Hawkins about the need not to say anything, and that was earlier. Was that an appropriate communication or instruction from Mr. Phillips?
It was. Could have had greater clarity, I suspect, but it was appropriate.
Would it have been helpful if Sergeant Frost had explicitly, at a juncture after everyone had settled a little, after the decision not to evacuate, instructed members to keep well apart from each other and under no circumstances say anything to each other about what happened?
Yes, insofar as possible, yes.
In all the circumstances, what level of criticism do you make of Sergeant Frost for having failed to do that?
I think overwhelmed with myriad of competing priorities, and I can understand how an oversight of that nature would occur, and I'm not overly critical of it.
Initial statements were obtained from everyone except for Mr. Rolfe, namely Mr. Ebel, Mr. Hawkins, Mr. Kirstenfeld and Mr. Donaldson, around and about 3 o'clock in the morning of the Sunday. Now, that was before the body-worn footage had been viewed by anyone. What do you say about the appropriateness of obtaining those narrative accounts at that early juncture before the body-worn footage had been seen?
I think it's appropriate as a free recall.
Now, a criticism might be made that not having seen the body-worn footage, there were few questions and the members were largely left to give their accounts in a narrative form as they deemed appropriate, and they weren't held to account in any way. What do you say about that?
I think, given the nature of the circumstances, it's understandable.
Okay. Why is it important to get an account as soon as possible, even if there are some limitations to the questions asked?
It's good investigative practice to get a free recall account as quickly as you can. I think it provides opportunities for the investigators to get that first opportunity recall of what happened, from their own, in their own words and their own time, outlining what occurred, and it's entirely appropriate.
Does it follow from the fact that those first interviews did not have the advantage of the interviewers having seen the body-worn footage, that almost inevitably there would need to be further interviews?
Yes.
In light of that, would it have been preferable for a clear instruction to have been given to each of those 4 members that they must not talk to anyone about the incident, or preferably associate with each other more than was necessary until they'd given their second statements?
Yes.
Now, as you know, it's a reasonably small police station at Uindamu.
Yes.
And there seems to have been some contact amongst the members during that evening when people were guarding the station and when they were in different parts of the station. What do you say about whether that was a problematic issue and further steps should have been taken to avoid the 5 members involved coming into proximity with one another?
It is a small locality, Your Honour, and insofar as possible, I think to keep them apart was wise and sensible. However, there were unusual and extraordinary circumstances going on at that particular moment at the police station. We've heard the evidence of their apprehension and fear, the coordination, the whole raft of activity that was going on around, and I'm not overly critical that they were unable to effectively do that.
There was a gathering which was a barbecue, and it appears that pizza was obtained and drinks were consumed on the Monday evening, at which some of the members involved in this matter were present, along with others. What do you say about the appropriateness of that gathering?
Yeah, Your Honour, I think that was unwise, ill-founded I preferred it wouldn't have occurred. They probably shouldn't have done it.
How do you think members of Kumanjayi's family would feel when members of the police were getting together and talking and drinking and eating within a couple of days of Kumanjayi having been fatally shot?
Your Honour, I understand the feelings of the community and the family. It would have been distressing.
In addition, they were present one with another before they'd given their second statements. What do you say about that, as a criminal investigator?
Your Honour, it creates a perception that regardless of the circumstances, that was not necessary. Had they have complied with some, had further direction not to meet collaboratively, I think there's still plenty of opportunities for the Northern Territory Police Force and the workforce here, who are really obviously trying to look after the wellbeing of our members, to have taken other steps to come up with a safety and wellbeing plan that didn't incorporate that event.
Now, one can understand that this had been a traumatic event for those members also, and those who cared about them, and there was some need for what's been described as a debrief informally, or for some support to be provided to them. But was the Monday barbecue the right way?
I think no. We could have provided. Well, it creates the perception, Your Honour, that we don't need that. There were other ways we can look after the wellbeing and health of our mental wellbeing of our of those members without necessarily having them all in the one location together. We could have done it in a different format, at least until we'd secured those second detailed interviews.
Thank you. I'm going to go back now to the issue of the communication of the passing of Kumanjayi. You referred in the apology which you provided to the community and to Her Honour to the fact that Betty Robertson was asked to identify the body of Kumanjayi, and you said that it was acknowledged that he was not the right person to ask, and Her Honour's asked you about respect. He shouldn't have been asked to identify the body of a close relative, should he?
No, and I accept that, Your Honour.
Okay. And it is a matter of respect for cultural values that you don't make that kind of request. Is it not?
Correct.
People should have known better.
Yes.
And then there was the provision of information a little while later. He was told that Kumanjayi had passed away. Yes?
Yes.
And he didn't want to be the bearer of that news to the community. Do you understand that that was understandable? Or that was an unsurprising response from him?
Yes.
And so the Sergeant Zhang, Sergeant Frost, and Sergeant King took themselves to the families to give them that news.
That's correct.
You say they did that appropriately?
No, Your Honour. I think
what was inappropriate and insensitive and wrong that they did?
Your Honour, we've seen the body-worn video. We've heard the evidence of those members identifying the deceased by the wrong name, the insensitivity around the delivery of the message and the communications that we had, and we could have done a much better job.
Now, how did it come about that TRG personnel were involved in delivering that? That's normally not normally the role of TRG persons, is it?
No.
Who normally delivers that kind of very difficult information to family members?
Often, from my experience, it would normally be the investigators that would do that. In this case, that didn't occur, and the newly appointed police forward commander took it upon himself to do that task.
And one might be pardoned for thinking that a concern that he ventilated when delivering that message was to keep public order and to keep everyone calm rather than compassionately
Show empathy, yes, you're right.
showing some care for the distress that the family would feel when they were told the tragic news.
Yes,
And they used his first name when that ought not to have happened, is that right?
that's correct.
So there are a variety of ways in which this should have been done differently and better. What can we learn from this, do you think? So that nothing like this ever happens again.
I think this inquest is a great forum for opportunities. Your Honour, if you're not aware, many members of the Northern Territory Police Force watch these proceedings and are following it. So we have a high degree of awareness.
Let's get down to specifics.
So again,
Giving this kind of information, how can it be done better next time?
I think promulgation of the new general order around how we were going to deliver death notifications.
It's not as if that kind of guidance is completely absent already, but it just went quite wrong this time, didn't it?
Yes.
Is there a need for further education about that kind of communication to all family members, including Indigenous families?
Yes.
What steps are going to be taken to ensure that that happens?
I think, Your Honour, we've touched upon it briefly. There's a whole raft of activity around enhancing our cultural sensitivities by Northern Territory Police across the board, not just with death notification, but across the board. They include, as we've discussed, the CREC, cultural awareness training, a whole raft of improvements, inclusion of ALOs at remote communities, ACPOs. We've heard of the value of Derek Williams and the fantastic role they play in community. There's a raft of those initiatives that are currently being delivered by the Northern Territory Police Force.
There's a process of revision of general orders in respect of a wide variety of matters in the aftermath of this incident. Is that right?
Yes, Your Honour. There's a total rewrite of all of the general orders of the Northern Territory Police Force has been undergoing for a period of time.
All right. And is this is attending to this issue part of that revision process?
Yes.
All right. Okay. I'd ask you to turn to paragraph 344. 344 of your first affidavit. You set out there a variety of the matters which have been revised, is that right?
Correct.
And turning then to all right, and you set out in your third affidavit a variety of the other changes that have been made in latter times to general orders. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Now, I'd like to deal with the next day when there was a need to safeguard the house 511, which is now often referred to as the memory house, and in police language at the time was referred to as the crime scene. Correct?
Yes.
Now, Her Honour's raised this with you. I'd just like to cover off on it by lunchtime. The house, of course, was where the events happened, and so had evidence in it and needed to be secured and protected for potential charges which might be brought and ultimately were. Yes?
Yes.
And so that was attended to early in the morning, a period of time after the meeting where the information was provided about Kumanjayi having passed.
That's correct.
As best you understand it, those who initially guarded the house did not carry long arms, did they?
Not to my knowledge. No.
But later on, Her Honour knows that 3 members did, and you've already said to her that that ought not to have happened.
Yes.
Her Honour's heard that the 3 men were provided with AR-15s before they left the airstrip in Alice Springs. Does it follow from the fact that they were provided with those weapons that they should carry them to the memory house?
No.
Ought they, in the best of all worlds, have spoken to someone and asked advice about when they should take their guns with them?
Yes. Again, it was an omission that didn't occur.
Yes. And is there any justification for their having been standing outside that house with long arms?
No, Your Honour.
And given the traumatic history, which dates right back, amongst other things, to the Coniston massacre, do you accept that that would have been experienced as very distressing by the community?
Yes, Your Honour.
Especially when Mr Hawkins had been walking around with his AR-15
Yes, Your Honour.
outside 511 the evening before.
Yes, Your Honour.
Did those 3 officers go from the airstrip directly to the...
No, I'm not sure if the Assistant Commissioner will know the detail. They went to the station.
so the TRG were there as well, and they didn't pick up the fact that these guys were leaving with their long arms?
No, the TRG are of course a separate group, so you probably wouldn't look to the TRG to give them instructions, but someone should have said to them, go and guard the crime scene, but no, you do not need to take your weapons with you, leave them here.
I know it's probably not the most significant point, but it's just a point that it's an important point, but it's just a very specific example of the fact that although there appears to be policies and procedures that the hierarchy believe the general members understand, it's an example of where there is not one person on the ground who appears to have understood that.
Your Honour, with the wisdom of hindsight, someone who presumably sent out the 3 men should have intervened and said, you don't need to take your AR-15s with you. That's not written down anywhere. For people who work in the remote communities, it's generally understood, but it appears that these men who'd come in from Alice didn't understand it and took the weapons with them. We say nothing in defence of that, and we accept that someone in authority ought to have intervened when they sent them out or when they saw them going out with their AR-15s and said, leave them at the station.
Well, the training needs to be very clear, and you need well-trained officers.
Your Honour, it is difficult. There's only so much you can train for. Every contingency can't be trained. It would be a difficult thing to say to recruits or in the midst of ongoing training, if you have to go out when there's been a fatal police shooting at a remote station, unless it is absolutely necessary, do not take long arms in any circumstances with you. What's necessary, we would say to Your Honour, is that someone in authority should have intervened and said, leave them here. But otherwise, we leave that to Your Honour's analysis. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Deputy Commissioner?
No, Your Honour, only in the fact that, again, that was brought to my attention watching and some images that were relayed during this inquest. So I think that was the first I became aware that they'd actually had them at the house was at this inquest. So again, there's a breakdown in communication between somebody on the ground. The fact that you carry an AR-15 to the community doesn't necessarily follow suit that you have to carry it into the field, and they didn't get direction not to do that. And at some point, obviously someone's woken up and told them not to, because
afterwards the members did not, after this trio took theirs and came back to the station, other members, so far as you understand it, did not carry AR-15s.
No, and as I said, Your Honour, the first I was aware was in this inquest when I saw images.
The Deputy Commissioner can respond. I thought there was evidence that at the meeting that Zhang had, that there were members with AR-15s in cars in sight of the people in the community.
My learned friend and I are not completely at odds with that, but we'll leave this to Your Honour. There seems to be some uncertainty about exactly what was happening there. That's how the evidence was left so far as I apprehend it, but that might be something for submissions. If that were the case, Deputy Commissioner, if there were TRG members with long arms that could be seen by members of the community during that meeting, should that have happened?
Again, I've seen no urgent need where they had to have AR-15s out in the community. I don't know what they mean by were they visible, were they in the back seats, or
Yes.
were they carrying them? It's unclear to me, but my expectation would have been that the AR-15s were secured in the vehicle unless we need them.
We'll leave that to Her Honour then. Now, could you go, please, as a last matter before we have the break, to paragraph 381 of your third affidavit. I asked you, and I was having trouble finding the spot, Your Honour, it's my fault. I'd like you to have regard to what you've said there in relation to the new General Order Crime, Homicide and Serious Investigations. You say there that additional guidance has been given to members in relation to the notification of to next of kin after a death. Could you just talk Her Honour through about the outcome of that and the guidance that exists?
So again, Your Honour, this is a comprehensive piece of work to try and promulgate a new general order to encompass what was previously 3 or 4 separate general orders. But again, it strikes at the heart of what the intent was, is to deliver the death notification in an appropriate way as quickly as possible.
And you make reference in your subparagraph 3 of that to such notifications being delivered in a culturally appropriate and sensitive manner, providing any information that's necessary to members of
Yes, Your Honour. That's the new general order.
Right. And will there be additional training to reinforce the words in this order,
Your Honour,
utilising what occurred here without pillaring the members involved, but to assist members to do better in future?
yes, as a learning, Your Honour, yes.
Your Honour, unless there's anything else you'd like to raise about that?
Not specifically. I know we're just about to take the lunch break, but it seems that you are attempting to address the cultural sensitivities around the delivery of the death notice. I have a little difficulty accepting that the decision not to permit family into the police station when Kumanjayi was passing was primarily to preserve his dignity. However, if that was the case, there are cultural considerations to be taken into account in relation to that decision as well that have been raised by the family. So if that's the justification, I'd like to understand how cultural considerations are being factored into that decision-making process.
We hear, Your Honour. The other aspect of what's been said to you is the causing of distress. Your Honour's probably seen the video footage.
Causing of distress and to preserve dignity is a cultural overlay. It may not have that same importance in the Aboriginal community. There may be other strong cultural reasons why family would prefer to witness this event and be present with a person who's passing even in distressing circumstances.
Yes, we understand what Your Honour is saying. It's a very difficult issue.
I understand from the evidence that a significant part of the decision-making around that was in relation to safety concerns. That's a different issue.
That's different.
But the explanation that's been provided here was to preserve dignity and to ensure that people weren't distressed. And if they are the explanations, then I think some cultural consideration needs to be given as to whether or not they are appropriate considerations. But with a journal lunch.
Thanks, Ron.